to you. If you're here for the launch of the Landscape of Microinsurance 2022, you're in the right place, and we're expecting quite a few participants. The room is filling up very quickly, so while we are waiting on people, let me just introduce myself. I'm Catherine Pulvermacher, Executive Director of the Microinsurance Network, co-chair of the IDF Insurance Development Forum Inclusive Insurance Working Group, along with Garance Water-Richard and Astrid Zwick, and also vice chair of Inclusive Finance Network Luxembourg. So here today, I am the executive director of Microinsurance Network. And let's just go through some housekeeping very quickly as more people are joining us. So I think you are automatically muted because this is a Zoom webinar. We will later on be having a Q&A. We've left plenty of room for Q&As, almost half an hour. When you do want to ask any questions, please use the Q&A function to do that, and use the chat if you're having any technical issues. We are recording this session for internal note-taking purposes, and the recording will be made in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, if you wish to access the webinar in French or in Spanish, please use the world icon that says interpretation at the bottom of your screen to access the French or Spanish channels. So if we can just move on very briefly to our agenda. We're going to begin with a little teaser video you might have seen floating around on social media. Once we finished with that, we're very happy to announce a little surprise that we have a guest speaker in the form of our colleague Jan Kellett from UNDP. Jan leads the Insurance and Risk Finance facility at UNDP, and he's going to be talking to you about the role of insurance in development, after which I'll be presenting the key findings. We've got some feedback from insurance stakeholders about the landscape study, and then, as you can see, we've left plenty of room for the Q&A. We do want to introduce you to the broader landscape team, who are again working on it this year. And without further ado, I think let's hit play for the teaser video. That should be coming up very, very soon. Great, thank you. Right, well, without further ado then, that's given you a broad perspective about the landscape and some of the highlights that many of you will have already seen. Before we present the key findings to you, I'm going to hand over to Jan Kellett, and he's going to be talking to you about why UNDP is so interested in insurance. So over to you, Jan, and I think you have some slides to share, so at your leisure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I can just check that you can hear me.
I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent, thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk a little bit about, not so much about the report in a sense, because you will do that, but actually from a UNDP perspective, maybe a development perspective as to why this fits into our model of working on insurance and why insurance is important for development. Because for us, we actually wouldn't be working on insurance, risk financing, risk transfer if it wasn't for the fact that it is critical for development. So that's really why we're here. So it's a great pleasure to be here. So I just want to share just a few words, a little bit on how we see it, how we see this framing our work. I want to talk really just in two parts. One on the, if you like, how we see the landscape report as a coming together or one further marker of collaboration between, for example, industry and the development sector and government, as we increasingly see insurance and risk financing at the heart of development. And then secondly, just talk about how we in UNDP actually consider insurance as critical to development, or if you like, a substantive point of view. So as you said, Catherine, I lead UNDP's global work on insurance and risk financing and head up the insurance risk financing facility. I think we'd probably look now in the last 10 years, the forums for collaboration on insurance and development were actually quite few and far between. Probably the Microinsurance network was one of the standouts. I'm not quite sure what the date was. You'll tell me later. But there wasn't that many. Perhaps reflecting the fact that, for example, development practitioners like ourselves in UNDP actually hadn't thought that insurance was important. If you looked back to the Millennium Development Goals, certainly insurance is nowhere to be seen. And it's not actually particularly well reflected even in the Sustainable Development Goals, which were created, 2013 and 14 and launched in 2015. But that said, we've seen a remarkable, I think, if you like, coming together of the insurance and development community in the last 10 years. I'm just going to pick out a few of them. You'll know them, probably, although those people working in this space. So there's the Insurance Development Forum, which Catherine mentioned, which we in UNDP co-created and co-chair. I co-chair it at the operational level, and Akim Steiner, our administrator, does so at the leadership level. We have which is, it's an industry-led forum, which is excellent, bringing together leaders, technical leaders, and indeed senior leaders from the insurance community. Then you have the Insurance Global Partnership, heavily supported by the German government, but now many others as well, much more sort of member state focused initiative. Now, both of those were actually started only in 2015, officially launched at the Paris Climate Conference. Then you have, for example, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance, focusing on coastal and ocean areas, only created in 2019 at the Secretary General's Climate Summit. We're a co-founder of that. So, just some of the main institutions. So this also, in another mirror, has also mirrored how UNDP has developed its own work in this space. So if you look back 10 years ago, we had no main program, no dedicated team on insurance and risk financing. So we've really gone from a scattering of work on insurance to setting up a dedicated technical resource, which is the facility, formally launched in 2021. We're already operational in 29 countries. And just as a note of two notes, really, on the one hand, in each and every case, working with the industry is core to that work, whether on risk financing solutions or indeed on inclusive, on microinsurance, core to the work. But if just as a note to demand, in last year alone, we had 31 other countries approach us for support that we just basically did not have resources to actually meet. So I think we know, whether we're coming at this from an insurance perspective, a government perspective, or a practitioner, development practitioner's perspective, we know that insurance is increasingly important and needed. So we really see the microinsurance reports, the Microinsurance Network report on the landscape report as a testimony to the continuing and deepening collaboration between these various sectors, public and private, international and national. We know it has funding from many sources, it has many different actors bringing in country research, including from national insurers, which I think is quite remarkable, and peer review from many directions. So it really is an excellent piece of work, and we're happy to invest in it and through it. just two reasons then. Why do we see it important, apart from what basically what I've said? On the one hand, because we think that the market intelligence that the report provides is actually pretty critical to our work, but also that work that we do with industry. And then secondly, because of the role of inclusive insurance, of microinsurance when it comes to development. So that's just my little intro on that side. Now I just have 3 or 4 slides to show you, which I'm going to do myself. So let me just do that. And there we go. So I've actually used the title of this year's Human Development Report. I would argue and ask all the people here who have not seen UNDP's Human Development Report, which is essentially our most important and high-profile research project that we in UNDP do each and every year, tracking human development for the last 30 years. I would urge you to do so. The title of the report is Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives. Well, if that's not in itself a clarion call to the insurance industry, I don't know what might be when it comes to development. We're already signaling something particular. I just picked out 3 graphics from the report to tell the story. So on the one hand, the report talks about how we essentially see families, communities, countries living in a really uncertain landscape with all different kinds of uncertainty all lived together. On the one hand, you know, what's happening to our planet, to the environment, what's called the Anthropocene. What's happening in terms of society and its transformations that we're seeing in society, some of it being pushed through digital and AI and other things, and then increasing polarization. 3 sort of main ways in which we're seeing increasing uncertainty. Secondly, I think this is a rather remarkable graphic, which basically has scraped 14 million different reports over more than 100 years, essentially literature, for essentially using words to track negative and positive thoughts on the world. I don't quite know how they do it. You'd have to look to the report for the details, but it's remarkable in terms of the findings and how we see in the last 20 years, negative feelings of the world have gone remarkably upwards. You see that massive spike in 1940 with around the war. Well, Second World War, here we have in the last 10 years, much more even higher spike than that. Again, look to the data and take your own conclusions. But I think we can say that there are certainly negative feelings about the world that we live in very strongly through this report. And then the final one I'm sharing with you is this. So the Human Development Report each and every year charts human development in each and every country. And
John, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We can't see the right-hand side of each slide. So we can only see up to 2009 in the current slide. And thank you, Violet. I wasn't sure if it was just me.
Right. Okay. I'm going to have to do a little bit of manual work. Can I see if I do it like that? Can you see it?
Absolutely perfect.
Okay. So let's just do this then so that we can see that. So sorry about that. So in the previous slide, so just in case you couldn't see, there you can see going upwards the spike in terms of negativity over in leading up to 2020. So let's just go to here. So this graphic actually is all of the countries each and every year which actually had a decline in human development. And you can see that some go up, some go down, but actually over time, the Human Development Report has always gone up, even in 2008, 2009, during the financial crisis. The difference was the COVID pandemic, particularly. So where we have more than 100 countries over those 2 years decline in human development. This is the first time ever human development has actually declined as a whole. Now, this is really, really important because if you put together COVID, if you put together with climate change, conflict in Ukraine, rising food and energy prices, hazards and shocks which are rising in terms of their frequency and severity, and vulnerable communities on the front line, this is a really quite catastrophic cocktail, you can almost say. So just going on to my final slide, why is this important? So maybe just one particular statement and then one, if you like, recommendation from the report, rather important to what we're talking about. So this was a survey done on human security around the world, which basically found out even before the pandemic, 6 out of 7 people felt insecure about their lives in general. 6 out of every 7th person, which is quite a shocking statistic. And this survey was done before the pandemic. And then secondly is the solution. Well, as I said, when we had the sort of formal launch of the report in Washington, DC, what is an antidote to, what is a solution to uncertainty? Well, certainly insurance is a part of it. And the Human Development Report actually says we need insurance, we need investment, we need innovation. Well, actually, the insurance industry is greatly involved in all 3 of those. for various obvious reasons. So I think so maybe as a final point to say that, this is really why we see the report as really critical, because we have a development situation which is really unsettled, really uncertain. And if we really want to have a sustainable part of sustainable development, we need insurance. And for that, we need things like the landscape report. And that's it from me. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Jan. And I know people have been asking in the chat, will the slides be available and so on. So we will certainly make a form of the main presentation available, and we'll append to that these graphics from the Human Development Report with a link to that as well. I think it's very good reading. And thank you to those who are mentioning in the chat your names and where you're from. It's always it's always actually quite humbling when we see how many people and the diversity of countries that are interested in this topic. And so I'd like to begin my remarks by thanking those of you who are participating today. And perhaps, Azia, if you could switch to the other presentation, the main presentation, to slide back to the agenda slide. So I would like to thank everybody that has made this possible. And there is a very, very long list. So I'm not going to call everyone out by name, but I particularly would like to thank everybody, all those organizations, more than 250 insurers in 34 countries, who actually provided the responses on which the report is based. And there are others that have supported the work in a different way for many years, and that is basically funding it. This is the flagship program of the Microinsurance Network. Just to remind everyone, the Microinsurance Network was actually started as a CGAP working group in 2002, so just over 20 years ago, and we became a non-profit organization based in Luxembourg in 2012. And so the first organizations that I would like to thank for their ongoing support as a partner, a development partner, and sponsor of the Microinsurance Network generally, and specifically of the Landscape Report, are the Luxembourg Directorate for Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs, and the Luxembourg Ministry of Finance. And of course, UNDP's Insurance and Risk Finance Facility, who has come in as a multi-year partner on the landscape, providing financing, but also helping us to improve the work, raise its visibility, and we're very grateful to Jan and his team for that. I'd like to mention particularly AXO Emerging Customers, who've been supporting the landscape certainly since I joined them 6 years ago, and they are now going into their 7th year of support for the landscape program and are actively involved in our working group that oversees the work. Swiss Re Foundation, very happy to welcome Swiss Re Foundation on board as a partner. Barents Re Reinsurance Company, that again has been supporting the landscape for a number of years. Aon Philippines, who came on board last year and have committed to support for a couple of years, 3 years in total. And the Insurance Federation of Egypt, which each year produces the Arabic language version of the report, which will be available shortly. So do look out on social media for when that is launched. There are many, many more. You'll be meeting some of the team, the actual microinsurance team, network team that works on this a little bit later. But there are also in-country collaborators. So each year, we work with in-country partners who contact the insurers on our behalf, work very closely with us through the whole process. And again, it's on their shoulders that we stand to get the data. Now, if we can switch to the next slide, please. I think it's good to remember why it is that we do the landscape work. What is it exactly that we're doing here? So roughly 4.8 billion people globally, which is nearly 70% of the world's population, are emerging consumers. They fall into the low and middle income bands defined by Pew Global Research, that is $2 to $20 international dollars a day on a purchasing power parity basis, that is. What we know based on responses from the new landscape study is that less than 10% of these emerging consumers are covered by insurance. This does not include public social security, and it is, of course, based on voluntary responses. Now, on that note, speaking of voluntary responses, what I would like to mention is that 4 countries last year, actually, we got responses from 100% of the insurers who are engaged in some form of inclusive insurance. And those 4 countries, I'd like to acknowledge the insurers in those countries and the support that we've had from the insurance supervisors and insurance associations in those countries in order to achieve this wonderful result. They were Zimbabwe, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So a big thank you to the respondents and everyone involved there. And we see each year that the response rates do go up. However, the response rates do vary by country. And what we know is that tracking the people protection gap is absolutely fundamental to closing the gap and to building financial resilience. And that is the purpose of the landscape study. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what is this landscape study exactly for those of you who may be less familiar with it? The 2022 landscape presents a view of the state of inclusive market development in 34 countries in the 2021 reference year. That is the data that was collected in 2022 and refers to what was happening in 2021. In 2022, we were very pleased to add new countries, 3 of them at the request of national insurance supervisors. We also restructured the report. We focused on risk families that link more intuitively to the Sustainable Development Agenda. And that came out not least in part out of the partnership with UNDP, brainstorming how we could improve the report, what would be most useful in terms of the end users. In addition, in each chapter, we have covered specifically women's uptake of inclusive insurance, as well as insurance that provides cover against the impact of climate change. And there are good reasons for doing that. The main reason being that women are, of course, affected by all sorts of risks, just as men are. And in addition to that, the impact of climate change is not just experienced through crops. It affects people in almost every area of their lives. And that was something that we wanted to reflect, as well as tracking the changes that are emerging in terms of product offerings, service offerings, and risk cover in that space. Next slide, please. Thank you. So being inclusive, I think it's good to start out with a bit of definition. So we talk about microinsurance and we talk about inclusive insurance pretty much interchangeably at the microinsurance network. And so I'd like to emphasize that while some very successful microinsurance products are sold based on the sachet principle, our definition actually focuses on the customer. So our focus is insurance that is designed specifically to meet the needs of emerging customers, including the risks that they worry about, their ability to pay, and taking their realities into account. Therefore, the data includes products sold to individual policyholders, sometimes referred to as sachet products, group policies, and also index-based or parametric schemes, as long as they're designed to meet the needs of emerging consumers. Next slide, please. And so here they are, the key results. Please do take your time. I'm not going to read out all of the figures. This table is taken, it's an adaptation of a table that is in the main report. So please do consult that. The report is available, of course, free of charge from our website. You can download it. If you're participating in the webinar, you may have been able to download it a little earlier than others. And And you may, if you aren't already registered on our website, all you have to do is register. It's a very simple process. That's simply so that we can track usage of the different downloads for reasons that I think are probably obvious. So we do encourage you to read the full report. Here, what I've shown is the data reported, drawn from the responses of the 253 insurers and more than 900 products. And of course, in the report, you'll be able to see how market penetration is broken down for health microinsurance, life, including accident, property and income, and agriculture, aquaculture, and livestock insurance products. Now, here, when we talk about penetration, we're really referring to the share of the estimated target population of emerging consumers in each country. From a business opportunity perspective, this is the median value. The value of premiums is the median value of current premiums adjusted for the total market of emerging consumers, and is therefore a very, very conservative estimate when we talk about the estimated total market, potential market value. The report also provides a like-for-like analysis that draws on data from products that have been reported every year for the last 3 years, where we've used a very consistent questionnaire. And from that analysis, from that like-for-like analysis, we see that customer numbers have almost recovered to pre-pandemic levels. But there is regional variation, and the strongest recovery has been seen in Latin America and the Caribbean. We also see from the same like-for-like analysis that the value of premiums has increased by 45% since 2019, with the strongest premium growth seen in Africa. Now, focusing on how these customers are reached, in 2021, that is the data reported in the 2022 landscape. In 2021, microfinance institutions were the largest distribution channel, reaching just over 64 million people. However, this is a small fraction of the number of microfinance clients in the countries covered, suggesting that here too there is a significant opportunity to build capacity and awareness in MFIs, to build awareness within MFIs, and so that they can in turn build the financial resilience of their clients by offering appropriate insurance products, and this beyond plain vanilla credit life. Now, what I'd also like to flag is that insurers, of course, use diverse distribution channels, and interestingly, while 38% of the products that were reported use digital platforms as a distribution channel, in Africa, this percentage was much, much higher at 47%. If we can move to the next slide, please. So thinking a little bit about premiums as value for money, here we're really talking about it in 2 ways. One is the products need to be sustainable from a business perspective, of course, but they also need to offer value for money to the clients. We also know that risk, obviously the estimate of risk is going to vary depending on the type of risk that is covered. That in turn is going to affect the price of the premium. And to a certain extent, that also is impacted by the region or the country specifically that is covered, obviously with respect to things like anything related to climate change. Those profiles vary greatly between countries. But the key point here with this slide is about social protection, social performance. And here we're talking about the value for money indicator, but the landscape report also includes data on social performance indicators such as claims acceptance rates, claims ratios, and turnaround time for paying claims. In fact, this time around, we included this value for money metric as a new metric intended to calculate the relative financial value of insurance, of the specific insurance, based on the ratio of premiums to the sum insured. In this case, of course, as I mentioned already, it is important to understand that the expected risk varies per product line and also by geography. Nevertheless, another factor is the availability of data on which to base risk modeling, and a lot of work is going on to improve that situation, to ensure that the premiums that are charged actually really do reflect the cost of the risk that is being covered. Moving on to the next slide, what we saw, and this is overall, not just on the like-for-like products, we saw that scale generally was up, but it has not fully recovered. So when it came to health products covering health, we saw that the scale per product was up by 9.8%. That means that there were nearly 10% more people were covered by these products than the previous data collection exercise. What we also saw as a new trend was that cover for medical expenses or surgery is now more frequent than covers for hospital cash, which was always the sort of traditional health microinsurance. I'd encourage you to read the different case studies. I always love case studies that are in the report. And in terms of the health chapter, there's a really interesting story about innovation with sharing premium costs along the value chain, which is a case study about a product that's being offered in Burkina Faso. It's a partnership between AXA and L'Oreal working with shea butter farmers and shea farmers, and often we think about the policyholders paying the full premium cost. In this case, in a rather innovative solution, it's actually shared between the off-taker, so L'Oreal that wants to buy the products, and the farmers themselves. We're seeing some of that model applied elsewhere in different markets, but this was a first for health insurance that we were aware of. Now, in terms of life and accident, this is a massive part of the market. So represents 2/3 of all of the products that were reported were covering some form of life and accident cover. It also represented 73% of the people that were identified as covered. And although we saw a 4% increase in scale overall, that marked a drop of 21% with respect to credit life and 43% in life insurance in terms of the number of people covered. For the first time under life and accident, also we're seeing the emergence of climate-related cover. So that's a very interesting point, further to what I said earlier. And moving on then to the more classical way that we have always thought about climate risk, but to which climate risk is by no means limited, is the agriculture, aquaculture, and livestock insurance. Now, in this category, premiums are often subsidized, but not always. And in fact, again, in one of the case studies, you can read about a livestock cover in Pakistan that has no subsidy at all. Not that we are suggesting that should be the case, but it does certainly show that there is appetite for buying insurance from consumers that is sometimes, not always, we often assume that consumers don't want to buy insurance, but when it's offered to them on the right terms, there clearly is appetite for it. So also interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, 5 out of 8 new products in this segment are index-based. And rather alarmingly, in terms of the people covered, the number of people had increased by 49% relative to the previous exercise, but only 36% of the people covered by this type of insurance are women. And that is an issue that we are looking into more. A lot of it has to do with what types of crops are covered by the specific insurance. Moving on to property and income in the microinsurance, thank you. In the microinsurance space, this is something of the new kid on the block. So we're watching with great interest as we see more of these products emerge. So it's not the first time we've seen them, but there are an increasing number of them. I think they started appearing in a meaningful way less than 5 years ago. And what's also interesting about this segment is that cash is not the primary payment method. So cash is the primary payment method for all of the other product types, but not for property and income, which are typically paid by bank transfer. the premiums are paid by bank transfer. Also, interestingly, somewhat bucking the trend of all of the other products, is that women are 60% of the people covered. We also see an emerging cover for climate risk. And last but not least, I'd like to flag the insurance for motorbikes, which might seem odd to include in a study on microinsurance, but the reality is that in many developing countries and emerging markets, people depend on motorbikes either as a form of income or for delivering product or getting to and from work. And so we have seen an escalation of the property insurance covering motorbikes generally. And we don't cover just the statutory, the mandatory motorbike or motor insurance. This is specifically different insurance, right? So there we go. So moving on now to the next slide. Very important in any insurance discussion probably is the regulatory frameworks. And here we've seen some really quite impressive progress. So our sister organization, which acts as an implementing agency for the IAIS, the International Association of Insurance Supervisors, kindly provides this updated map each year. And they've also launched an interactive map on their website, and I encourage you to take a look at that. Now, 2021 saw several supportive regulatory changes. Specific inclusive insurance regulation or microinsurance regulation was introduced in Brazil, Colombia, and Ghana, making a total of 35 countries with such regulation. Another 19 countries are actively developing microinsurance regulations, and still others are revising existing regulations. Over the last 5 years, there has been a trend towards regulators being given an explicit legal market development mandate, and this is an important shift and one that is driving the market forward. That is certainly the case. Stakeholder interviews and our own experience show that supervisors want more and better data on market conduct and on the quality of insurance offered, and that the key issues that they're grappling with comprise addressing the protection gap, particularly with respect to exposure to climate change and natural disasters, because of the need to create regulations to govern index insurance. Regulators and supervisors also need to keep pace with technological developments, notably how to oversee and enable online sales, but also upskilling their own systems. So you may hear the terms SIPTech and RegTech used in this respect. All of this requires quite a lot of investment of time, which of course means an investment of money. In addition, the supervisors are working out how to incorporate concerns around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the ESG taxonomies, and of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, which I believe is pretty much it. So we're going to move on now to a little video that we produced and in fact launched at the International Conference on Inclusive Insurance last year in Jamaica, which gives you a bit of a sense of how different stakeholders are using the landscape. So if we can switch to the video now, please.
The landscape study provides us with information on global and regional microinsurance products and services. This helps us to redefine our strategies in terms of products, distribution channels, claims management to better serve our emerging consumers. It also helps us identify new opportunities to develop inclusive insurance.
With the information provided by the landscape study, we can assess where we stand in relation to emerging trends in our region in order to revise our inclusive insurance strategy if necessary. This study also helps us to identify new leads to develop inclusive insurance to build the resilience of vulnerable populations.
This year, thanks to the efforts made together with the Microinsurance Network, we will be able to have information and a diagnosis of the microinsurance market. We hope that this information will allow us to develop strategies that respond to the needs of the market and help us to position microinsurance as a priority topic in the country's sustainability agenda.
The microinsurance landscape study helps us to be aware of the developments and experience globally that support insurance inclusion. With the emerging trends, we're able to identify opportunities and develop customer-centric solutions for our emerging customers.
For several years in Argentina, we have been working with the industry to collect disaggregated data for microinsurance. This year, thanks to the efforts made together with the microinsurance network, we will be able to complement the microinsurance data and thus have a complete diagnosis of the market. We hope that this information will allow us to develop policies aimed at fostering the development of a more inclusive market.
Since the landscape study provides precious information on microinsurance, the Insurance Federation of Egypt took the initiative to translate it into Arabic in order to enable the Egyptian market in reaching the financially marginalized segments and achieving financial inclusion.
Hace 2 años en Costa Rica no teníamos información desagregada para los microseguros. Este año y por segunda vez consecutiva, gracias a la alianza con Microinsurance Network, la industria cuenta con una herramienta que, si bien en un principio nos permitió tener un diagnóstico del mercado, ahora nos permitirá monitorear la evolución y desarrollo del mismo. Esperamos que con esta información podamos desarrollar políticas que respondan a las necesidades de nuestra población.
The 2021 landscape study covered the impact of COVID-19, which I find very insightful and useful because it presented how different stakeholders from various countries were affected and how they pivoted amidst the situation. COVID-19's impact on insurance in the different regions is quite similar in the Philippines. The heightened awareness and increased demand for health insurance and the need to tweak the processes during the lockdown. Most of us witnessed the same scenario in our respective areas. So, in a way, the study shows how our situations are alike in some ways or different in other ways, and how each of us deal with these situations is something we can all learn from.
Thanks to the alliance with Microinsurance Network starting this year, Guatemala will be part of a study, The Landscape of Microinsurance. With the information provided, it will allow the country to be projected internationally and support the Insurance Working Group for our financial inclusion strategy, to develop activities that have a positive impact on the inclusion of insurance for the benefit of Guatemalan population.
Let's close the protection gap together.
Let's close the protection gap together.
Tujibe pengo la ulinzi wa watu kwa pamoja.
आए सब मिलकर लोगों की तहफ़्फ़ुज़ को यकीनी बनाएं.
Tuzibe pengo la ulinzi wa watu pamoja.
Let's close the people protection gap together.
لنعمل معا على سد الفجوة التأمينية وتقديم التأمين لمن يحتاجه.
Let's close the people protection gap together.
Cerremos juntos la brecha de protección. Hagámoslo juntos.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. I'd like to invite now the microinsurance team, Nicolas, Karini, Stephanie, and Sarah, please to put on your cameras. We also, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of Mark Robertson, who was working with us on the landscape until August last year, and Gemma McClear, who left us in January, but also did some of the setup work for last year's exercise and is now part of the team at Microinsurance Centre at Milliman. working with Michael McCord and his colleagues there. So just very briefly, I'd like to ask the team, each of you, to introduce yourselves, and then we're going to move into the panel discussion. I see that there have been some questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and so of course we'll address those as well. So Stephanie, could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Catherine. Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Swejede. I'm the Means Africa Regional Manager, and I'm based in Togo, West Africa, and I'm involved in the landscape study, in preparing data collection. I'm also involved in collecting data, in particular in French-speaking countries, and data analysis and working with the team. Thank you. And over to you, Nicholas.
And thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Catherine. So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, depending where you're based. Thank you very much for joining us today. It is very important for us that you are taking part of this launch of one of the most important reports for the microinsurance market. I'm Nicolas Morales. I'm Means Regional Manager for Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm very proud to see how every year the study collects more information for more companies, for more products. Just for 2022 report alone, information was collected on 90 variables from more than 900 products, representing almost 85,000 entries that needed to be compiled. So Sarah, that is also part of the team, that it's also has also joined the call today. Together, we have been responsible of the verification, compilation of this data for the further analysis of the data. Additionally, this year, I'm very proud to share with you that I have been supporting the Means Landscape Best Practice Group as co-chair. And finally, I just want to invite you to go directly to our website, download the report, and make the most of the information we have compiled for you.
Thank you, Nicholas. So if I can just invite Karimi to introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everyone. My name is Karimi. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I recently joined the MEAN as the regional coordinator for East and Southern Africa. I'll be working closely with the landscape team, coordinating data collection in Kenya, as well as analysis in East and Southern African countries. And really happy that all of you could join the call, and hopefully we make use of the data that has been presented. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sarah, if you could introduce yourself briefly, please.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Just as it's a pleasure to be part of this great team and project. I am Sara Orozco. I am based in Bogota, Colombia. This is my second year in the team. I am currently the regional coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean, and I support the coordination of the landscape study. And as we have said, let's do it together and let's close the protection gap together.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to use my prerogative. I can see there are a couple of questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those. But just to kick off, Stephanie, you're very close to the data, you and Nicholas, and I wondered what your thoughts are on how the landscape study series has helped to stimulate growth in inclusive insurance.
Thank you, Catherine, for this question. It's true that in some countries, data is collected on inclusive insurance, but the value added that we bring through the landscape study is that we collect additional data together for every product, and each product information on distribution channels, means of payments, and also data on gender and risk covered, among other indicators. And the fact that this data is collected in more than 30 countries across 3 regions, and that is done every year, allows for comparative analysis. And yesterday I was speaking with a regulator, and he was telling me that a lot of insurers, they want to have information about the products they can develop for emerging consumers. And they saw the landscape study is a key report that gives them this information of what can be done to serve emerging consumers and close the protection gap.
Great, thank you. And Nicholas, I mean, you know, we talk about about this sort of in generic terms, but could you perhaps give an example of how the landscape is helping to inform policy and especially business decisions, as well as determining product design and market entry for the private sector?
Yeah, sure, Catherine. Maybe I think it's important to mention that we are the only platform that brings together all the players in the insurance market, and therefore the use of information and of the study varies according to the needs of the different actors that are part of the market. In some cases, we have seen how the information has been used to visualize market opportunities, to improve product design, and in other cases, the data has been used to serve as a benchmark for program development or even regulatory assessment. Just to give you some examples and share some of the experience with the people that are with us today. Last year, the Financial Superintendency of Colombia shared with us that they have used the microinsurance landscape study as the basis for the development of their own questionnaire to collect information disaggregated by microinsurance product in the country. In fact, thanks to this information that it's currently collected in Colombia, it's one of the few countries in the region that currently disaggregates and reports data disaggregated by this type of products. Indeed, I also think it's important to mention that this information has been incorporated as part of the financial inclusion report that has been published for several years in the country. And quite recently, the superintendency also shared with us that they have been using some of the data, some of the findings published in the report to adjust to adjust the microinsurance definition they are currently using in the country. Maybe to give you another example that I think it's worth mentioning is the current alliance we have with FIDES, the Inter-American Federation of Insurance Companies, with whom we have been able to incorporate all these findings, all these lessons learned into from the landscape study for the development of a diagnostic for the inclusive insurance market in the region, in order to identify this good practice and to promote a more favorable environment for these projects. Additionally, I also want to share with you that this year we are working together with the FIDES Regulatory Working Group in the development of a report that analyzes the different microinsurance definition in the region. And we are using the information of the microinsurance landscape study to contrast elements such as limits on the premiums, sum insured, which are elements that usually the countries are using for the development of their own definition of microinsurance products, and which we have seen that when they are not correctly established can become a challenge for the industry. So there are many more examples like this one, but I don't want to take all the time giving those examples. I also want to give the opportunity to my colleagues to add to this.
Great. So we have quite a few questions in the Q&A, and we have one from Elodie de Varlincourt from Swiss Re, who is asking about the average number of clients covered by microinsurance, by the microinsurance products reported. And I know this is a data point that we collected and we reported on the median per product type in the main report. But I wondered, Nicholas and Stephanie, if you have a comment about that. So Elodie's question, which of course you can read, is that as a donor organization supporting indirectly microinsurance or also through facilities or directly in their Entrepreneurs for Resilience Award, this is an important metric, and perhaps they've set the targets too high. With a minimum in health of 30,000 people served, looking to reach 100,000 in a 3-year period. But Nicholas and Stephanie, based on the data that you've seen, what are your thoughts about that, about the average number of clients covered per microinsurance product?
Thank you, Elodie, for the question. So what we can say is that we see a lot of differences like across regions and countries, and we can of course look more closely to the average. It's true that in the report we give information per type of risk. For example, you've mentioned, I think in your question, health and ag products. So for example, for agricultural products, we see some kind of high numbers, in Africa and Asia. And for health products, we see the trend that we've seen this year is that there are more and more bundled products with like health covers. So it also affects the clients covered by these products. And this is something we also highlight in the report to say that there are more products that have maybe as primary risk, maybe life, and as secondary risk, health. And it also affects the number of clients covered. So what I can say here in the glass that it's growing, the number is growing, but for that, it's when we look at like those risks covered as second risk or third risk, we see that those numbers are growing, but there are differences looking at the types of risk covered of the categories.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. So Nicholas, over to you for the question from Rodrigo.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so we have a question from Rodrigo Tamayo. He's asking here. I also invite all the teams to add their comments. So how we can achieve higher coverage or penetration of inclusive insurance for vulnerable population or the most needed.
Okay, so maybe I'll give that one a stab. And I think after that, we're going to have time for one last question and a very brief answer. And perhaps Stephanie and Nicola, well, Stephanie, you can think about that, you know, the coverage. Why are there so few covers? Why are there such little microinsurance in Cote d'Ivoire and Mali, right? So I think you're in a very good position to field that one. But on the question about the vulnerable population, so we look at emerging consumers between $2 and $20 a day, because primarily what we're looking at is the gap in the market that is closed through the private sector. So our observation is that people that are living on less than $2 a day do not have money to pay insurance premiums. They barely have enough money to feed themselves and their families. And therefore, the insurance needs of the most vulnerable should really be covered through public funds. And so we absolutely would not want to suggest that they don't matter. They matter very, very much indeed. But they absolutely are not in a position to pay for premiums. Now, the emerging customer band, it's quite a broad band. We see a lot of people, a lot of households that have emerged from poverty, and the important role that insurance plays here is when disaster strikes, which sometimes is not a catastrophic disaster in the way that we might think of it, like a natural disaster or a hurricane or something like this. But it can very often be an everyday risk that materializes. Someone gets sick and the family is ending up having to choose between getting medical care or paying school fees or buying farm supplies. And it's really tragic when they could have been helped by having insurance and not have to have made those hard choices. So I would say at the kind of lower end, maybe we're looking more at that kind of resilience, but even up into the emerging middle class, if you do the maths and you think about $20 a day, we're talking about people who may well be salaried, but the reality is there's very little insurance for retail customers in many of the countries that we're covering. Stephanie, so the question about Mali and Cote d'Ivoire, very quickly before we wrap up.
Should I answer in
English, please? Yeah, so because it will be translated into French.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Diallo, for this question. So why we don't have a lot of projects? What I can say, knowing the trend, is that there's more and more interest in microinsurance, but what I also know is that there's a need for raise awareness, not in the clients, but even when we're talking about insurers, because most of them, a lot of insurers still think like inclusive insurance or maybe microinsurance is not maybe profitable, or so there's still a work to do to raise their awareness and talk about inclusive insurance, what we are talking about, the type of products that they can develop to cover those emerging consumers, but also give an idea that we are talking about billions of people. So sometimes we feel when we approach insurers, in particular in the zone you mentioned, like in the countries that they have a lot of questions. Is this profitable? Are we talking about poor people? So we also doing this work through the landscape reports of saying, okay, we are talking about billions of people that they can see every day, and people that need insurance, people that can pay for insurance if they find products that meet their needs. So yeah, to be brief, that's what I can say. Yeah, but we can continue the discussion. Please feel free to send me,
Now, we are out of time, and I know that we haven't answered all the questions yet, but perhaps I could ask our colleagues to put up the feedback poll. Please answer the feedback poll. It's very helpful for us to get your feedback. And while you're doing that, perhaps, Nicolas, you could very, very briefly, in less than a minute, answer Peter Freder's question about inclusive insurance versus microinsurance regulation.
Sure, Catherine, thank you so much. Yeah, so indeed, we have been able to identify those countries that currently have developed a regulatory framework for microinsurance product. As Peter mentioned, Costa Rica is one of the countries that currently have incorporated inclusive insurance as part of the regulation. Just to clarify, in the case of Costa Rica, even inclusive insurance are mentioned in the regulation. This does not mean that the regulation has been established only for that particular products. Indeed, the regulation states that the seguros autoexpedibles, that is the category that are currently using, is the sum of the inclusive insurance, microinsurance product, and massive insurances. But just to answer Peter's question, quite recently, last year, Bolivia has been the only country in the region that has developed a specific regulatory framework based for inclusive insurance. So I will be more than happy to share with you the information regarding that particular experience.
Thank you so much, Nicolas. And thank you to those of you who have participated in the webinar today. Thank you very much. I also acknowledge that there are some questions that we haven't got to. We will email you after this with the answers to those questions. And please, for general information, which was one of the questions, how to get involved with microinsurance and inclusive insurance, please do email us. You can email us at info@microinsurancenetwork.org. You should all have that email address.
Vous pourrez nous envoyer un courriel. Nous avons hâte de vous rencontrer dans le futur. C'est le lancement du rapport. Et au courant de l'année, nous allons produire des études qui vont permettre d'enrichir au niveau de connaissances. Des recherches sont faites sur la microassurance. Alors, merci encore en tous. Merci à nos panélistes. Merci à John Calette, notre orateur principal. Merci encore à vous. Merci pour les données que vous avez mis à disposition. J'ai hâte que l'on puisse avoir une collaboration fructueuse cette année. Et merci encore d'avoir mis la barre très haut. Merci encore à tous. Prenez soin de vous. Et on se dit à très bientôt. Merci.